I love Harvest Sunday. It's the time I get to preach surrounded by snacks. Always good. We were a little nervous about Harvest Sunday this year. Quite honestly, I've told you about that. Moving it from the end of the year, which is where we normally do it, to moving it in the summer where schedules are crazy, people are traveling and things like that. We weren't quite for sure, quite honestly, how the turnout would be. It looks to me like this worked really well. So thank you to those of you who brought, who participated, who gave. And if you missed class this morning to hear Adam Allen present about the good work happening at Carpenter Place, you missed out. Adam, you did a great job talking about the work and the girls, and it was clear and apparent to all that your heart is in it. And we love Carpenter Place, and we love you all and all of the house parents and people that are involved with Carpenter Place in so many ways. They do such a great mission work right here in our own backyard. And we foresee a long partnership with Carpenter Place and grateful for the work that they do. It all started with a long sermon. And that long sermon created problems. Can you relate? Anybody? It wasn't mine. It was Jesus's. So I'll let you deal with that if you have a judgment towards a long sermon. But it was a lesson that I'm not sure Jesus planned to teach, at least as far as the sermon went. But he did teach something that day that I know the disciples never forgot. And it all started with a question and led them to an answer they weren't quite ready for. We are on the summer Sundays in a series called The Questions That Jesus Asked. I apologize, guys. My clicker does not seem to be working. So, Will, you're up. The sermon is in your hands. Go ahead and advance it one more. This is the sermon series where we are looking at the questions that Jesus asked. By one count, there's over 300 questions that Jesus posed in one form or another throughout his ministry and throughout the Gospels. We're not going to go in this series through all 300 plus questions, but I do think it is worth studying and listening to the questions that Jesus asked of those people and of us today. These questions reveal our motives. These questions cut to the heart. These questions, if we'll pay attention, will teach us a great deal. And today's question comes from Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6 is where we're going to be. This account occurs in all four of the Gospels, but Mark chapter 6 is the one that I've chosen, and we're going to be there. And if you don't know where Mark chapter 6 is, if you're a guest, reach in front of you and grab one of those brown pew Bibles and turn to page 1080. And you can keep that pew Bible as our gift to you. But Mark chapter 6 is where we are. If you'll advance the slide, Will. Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 34 is where we are. And you probably have a title over your text. And it's easy to see that title and go, okay, I know the story. I already know what this is going to, I already know what the message is. I already know what the application, okay, I got it. And I want to ask you to pause on getting ahead of yourself and really try to view this story with fresh eyes and an open heart. Now, in the context of Jesus' ministry, at least according to Mark's account, we've got a couple things to note. One, Jesus has been rejected in his hometown. They've heard this guy before. They're not really impressed with Jesus. This is the carpenter's son. Everybody knows Manny, as they used to call him. Everybody's familiar with Jesus, and so because they're familiar with him, they don't really pay attention to him. Then Jesus, in his ministry, begins to not only go out, but he begins to send out the disciples. And as he's sending them out, he is preparing them for the kingdom work that he's going to do, as we'll see in the book of Acts. He's beginning to send these common, ordinary, uneducated, untrained guys to do kingdom work. And they are coming back and they're excited about that. And then Mark tells us that along the way, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, has been martyred. And so there's a mix of things happening in the context. And then we step into Mark chapter 6, where Jesus begins to do something that is unforgettable. And this is the only miracle that I know of that occurs in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And all of them have a slight variation on it, but the feeding of the 5,000 was something that clearly made an impact and an impression in the lives of the disciples. As we look at Mark chapter 6, now in verse 30, I want us to begin reading. Will, if you'll advance the slide. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. Now, this is after they'd been sent out. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." And Jesus is saying it's not just all about going and doing. You need to take time to rest for your physical body, for your soul. Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Mark is preparing us for what's about to happen. Then they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves, and many saw them going and recognized them. And they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Why had the crowd gathered? They had gathered to hear Jesus. They had gathered to hear this good news that had been being preached. They had gathered to see the miracles done. And excitement was beginning to build. And the reason that they had gathered specifically is because they were helpless. This is why Jesus had compassion on them. Remember, Jesus did not plan on preaching this message. He was telling them, let's go away. Let's go to a desolate place. Let's rest. But seeing these throngs of people, if you can just imagine the crowds coming to Jesus and begging him, "Rabbi, teacher, Jesus, Emmanuel," they cried out and begged him. And Jesus taught them not out of, I don't think, necessarily want or because it was on his mission, but out of sympathy for these helpless, unshepherded people. And so, because they're coming out of from everywhere, and because Jesus is a compassionate teacher, he begins to teach them, and he begins to preach to them. And Jesus kept preaching to them. In fact, he began to preach so much that the disciples became troubled. They became a little bit worried, became a little bit awkward. I don't know if you've ever been there or not, but sometimes the preacher goes long and long, and you're thinking, is he not aware that we're so close to lunchtime? Is he not aware that if we don't get out soon, we will not beat Riverlawn to the restaurants? Is he not aware? Well, they're troubled, but let's keep reading. Verse 35. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late." Hint, hint, Jesus. "Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." And then Jesus says this, but he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" What was the disciples' concern? Jesus had been teaching them and preaching to them and feeding not their bodies, but their souls and their hearts. And the disciples are realizing that there is no restaurant close by. There's nothing for these people. There's going to be a mutiny. They're going to begin to get hangry, and we don't want that. So Jesus, it's been a while now. I think you've made the point. Why don't you go ahead and send them away? They're not going to leave unless you send them away. Their primary concern is food. Physical food, physical bread, the physical hunger that they were partaking of. They're saying effectively to Jesus, Jesus, read the room, man. Look at the people. They are hungry. Which probably tells me that they're saying, Jesus, we're kind of hungry. We'd rather not stay. We know you have all the answers. We realize you're the Son of God. We know it's good. But my stomach's starting to growl a little bit. And yet Jesus seems to understand that people hunger for things deeper than food. And he asks them to do something. In fact, in John chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus will say, do not work for food that perishes, but for food that endures to eternal life. Jesus often disregarded his physical state to help people grow and learn and mature spiritually. And that's what he wants the disciples to learn, and that's what he tells them. You give them something to eat. Now, obviously, this is way over their ability. I mean, they've just been sent out for the first time. How are they supposed to feed this crowd of thousands of people? How are they supposed to do that? We're supposed to give them something to eat? And you hear this. If we had 200 denarii. Now, to give you some perspective, a single denarii was a day's wage. So it's a real easy equation here. They're saying if we had 6 months of our earnings and you put it in a pile, you wouldn't have enough to buy everybody something to eat. How are we supposed to do it? And then Jesus gets more direct. Keep reading. John chapter 6, verse 38. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said 5 loaves, 5 and 2 fish. Okay, so the question that Jesus asked is the title of the lesson. How many loaves do you have? Now, we think we know the answer. We call this the miracle of the 5 loaves, the 2 fish. We say that's the answer. That's how many they have. But that's not how many they had. You have to go to one of the other Gospels to find the answer. The answer seems apparent, but when we go to the Gospel of John, thankfully it's also in the 6th chapter, the Gospel of John tells us that they didn't have a single piece of food. John chapter 6, verse 9, tells us this same account with this detail. There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But how far will they go among so many? You see, the disciples had nothing to offer on their own. What they had was so insignificant. They had nothing in their pockets. They had nothing that they were carrying with them. They had nothing to bring. It is as they asked the question, Jesus, send them away, because they all forgot to bring the food. And Jesus, when he says, how many loaves do you have? We have to go to John to understand that it wasn't their food. It wasn't their 5 loaves. It wasn't their 2 fish. It belonged to a little boy whose name we don't even know. Now, think about it like this. When I think of a loaf of bread, I think of, kind of a gargantuan piece of carbohydrates, okay? This nice loaf, okay? That wasn't a loaf in the first century. First century loaf looked probably something closer to this. A small piece, barely fits in your hand, may have been leavened, may not have been. But this is barely half of a sandwich. The kind of loaves that they were carrying were not significant. 5 of these still didn't solve the problem. They have nothing, and what they do have is completely insufficient to the task. You see, amongst the people, there was no expectation that there would be lunch. They didn't care about that. They were running, and they weren't making plans for the day. They didn't plan on seeing Jesus. They saw Jesus and said, now's our chance. Let's go and find him. Let's go and sit at his feet. And they chased him down because they wanted to hear from him. They had no plans for lunch. It's something that maybe we can relate to this morning. I'm curious, out of 500 plus folks, how many of you, with you, right now, have brought lunch? Oh. Okay. Well, the answer to the question still works. Zane, come here for a second. Okay, so in a totally unplanned moment, Zane brings forth his offering, which is especially valuable today because you can't get it. I see, Zane, that you have ordered 2 original chicken sandwiches. Great stuff right there. I'm going to put this empty bag on the Harvest Sunday offering. Now, it actually kind of works because there's 2 loaves and 1 fish. And there's 2 more loaves and 1 fish. We got a couple pickles on there, but if we can give a modern equivalent, the disciples had nothing, and the little boy had this: 5 loaves, 2 fish. He wasn't planning to feed anyone but himself and maybe his family. You see, the disciples had nothing, and the little boy had next to nothing. And it's really important that we understand that because if I say to you this morning, hey, welcome to Northside, we're so glad you're here. We have a lunch prepared in your honor. We'd like everybody to come and stay. We have 2.5 Chick-fil-A chicken sandwiches. You'd be making other plans. Brother, I think we've got plans somewhere else. I think we'll just stop by the local restaurant. This is so insignificant. What we have on our own is so insignificant. And yet, that's because it's in our hands. What happens is Jesus is able to take this insignificant offering and make it into a completely significant offering. Do you understand that? That so many times we think of what we bring to Jesus like we're some great, talented, wonderful person, like he didn't give us all the things we have, and we give us this offering as if to say, Lord, here you go. I give this to you. When really what he wants is to place the things that he's given us in his hands to do his work. Let's keep reading in Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, verse 39 is where we are. And then he commanded them all to sit down in the groups on the green grass. And so they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves, again, 5 loaves, so insignificant, and the 2 fish. And he looked up to heaven, and he said a blessing, and he broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. This is so significant that we remember that what was brought to Jesus that day was nothing, next to nothing, close to nothing. But with the little boy's lunch, insignificant as it was, in Jesus' hands, it was everything. So let's pull back from this well-known story and learn some lessons that I think are important for us to try to learn. What are the lessons? Number one, you are not enough. There is a phrase familiar in our world today that is, you are enough. You are enough. And it sounds good, but it's completely anti the gospel. Because the gospel is all about we are not enough. We don't bring enough. Nothing in my hand I cling, simply to the cross I cling, as the old hymn goes. I have nothing to bring you, Lord. There is nothing of myself, of my skills, of my person that I bring to you, and that it is sufficient to the task you have. Like the apostles, we really have nothing to offer. Like the little boy, what we have to offer is insufficient to the task. But with 5 small loaves and 2 simple fish, Jesus can feed a crowd that would fill Entrust Arena. Only Jesus can do that. I can't do that. You can't do that. None of us are capable of doing that. And we must learn this if we're going to accept the full gospel of Jesus, that we bring nothing to the table. It is only the work of Christ in us that makes all the difference through us. The loaves and the fishes by themselves were nothing, but it was Jesus who took them and made them into something. And this may be hard to hear, but in a world that tells you you are enough, the gospel says you aren't even close to enough. And that's said in a loving, heartfelt way. But you cannot come to the cross with illusions that you bring anything to the table. Turn to John chapter 15, a verse that is not connected to these stories, but a teaching that I think is significant. Toward the end of the ministry, Jesus is teaching his disciples the most important lessons, and he uses this illustration of a vine and branches. And we're going to go through all of John 15, but I want to point you to verse 5. The scripture reads very simply, I am the vine. This is John 15:5. I am the vine, you are the branches. Now look what he says here. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, fill in the blank here, for apart from me you can do I don't have much vineyard experience, but I do know this. We picked blackberries the other day, which fruits that grow on a vine. It was a fun little family outing. And the fruit was beautiful. But the moment we picked it, it began to die. Do you know why? Very simple. It wasn't connected to the vine. And Jesus is reminding them, and he's reminding us, that apart from him, you can do nothing. You see, the question is not whether you're enough. We know that you're not enough. The question is, are you willing to let Jesus be enough? As he will tell you, apart from him, you can do nothing. And that may be hard to hear in our very self-sufficient culture, but But we need to know that when it comes to Jesus, we are not enough, which leads us to the second and more important point, that Jesus is more than enough. You cannot. You can't. But he sure can. The apostles didn't plan on feeding several thousand people that day. The apostles couldn't feed several thousand people that day. They had nothing to do it with. A little boy, perhaps his own mother packing his lunch, just as a provision for her son, was sent out to see Jesus, and he did not plan on feeding thousands of people that day, and he didn't. But he did share what little he had. And Jesus, the bread of life, fed thousands upon thousands of people that day. And that's why Jesus is more than enough. Forevermore and always, Jesus is more than enough. And if you come to church or you're watching online and you feel insufficient, may I gently say to you, that's the right place to be. You're not enough, but Jesus is more than enough. And with him, all things are possible. So the last point, and this is a really important one, especially for people who are followers of Jesus, is this. We are not called to feed, which is an odd thing to say on Harvest Sunday. We're not called to feed, but we're called to be faithful. Question for you. Who did the feeding in the story? It was Jesus who did the feeding. The apostles distributed it. The little boy offered it, but it was Jesus who did the feeding. And sometimes as followers of Jesus, we take it upon ourselves and say, you know what? Somebody needs toilet paper. I guess I'll do it. We think it's our job to feed. It's our job to provide. It's our job to make sufficient. But it's not. If I read this story and believe that it's true, and I believe that it is, we see that it's Jesus who does the feeding. And we're simply called to be faithful in it. We're called to be faithful with the bread, with the loaves, the fish that Jesus gives to us. You see, it's his work. It's his work. I love the folks at Carpenter Place, but it's not their work. It's his work. I love Northside. We do a lot of good things, and we're on mission with a lot of things, but it's not our work. It's his. And if we keep that in mind, it will help us to be faithful with what he gives us. You see, Jesus invites us to participate in his work. Think about this. Did Jesus need the apostles to find food? Of course not. Did this whole miracle hinge on hoping that a little boy would have been faithful and bring his lunch that day? Of course not. Jesus wanted to remind them and all of us that his work is his work, and that we have the opportunity to participate, that we have the opportunity to partner with him. And so my final question is this. On Harvest Sunday, are you being faithful with what God has given you? Because in his hands, little is much. In his hands, what is insufficient is more than enough. In his hands, Jesus will use whatever loaves and fish that you will be faithful with. So my question is for you, are you being faithful with what he's placed in your hands? And you are acknowledging that that came from him anyway, and that whatever you offer is part of his work, not my work. It all started with one long sermon and several thousand nearly empty stomachs. for Jesus to teach the apostles that they couldn't do it without him. To show a little boy that in Jesus' hands, whatever is placed there is more than enough. And to encourage all of you and all of us to be faithful with what he places in our hands. This morning, if you're not following Jesus, we have an invitation for you to do so. If you're ready to do what Jesus said to do, which is simply to believe and be baptized, to take that first step of your Christian walk, we'd be happy, more than thrilled to have you participate, to be a part of God's work. If you're ready to take that first step, just meet me down front and we'll make the arrangements. But if you've been following Jesus and maybe you've been focused on yourself, and maybe you've been feeling insufficient, or maybe you just haven't been participating at all, maybe you need the prayers of our shepherds, or maybe you need the prayers of this congregation. If you have that need, head to the back and meet a shepherd at either of these doors, any of these doors, and they'll help you and pray with you and pray for you. Whatever needs you might have, if you have one, now is the time to respond as together we stand and sing.
God